أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. My dear friends, Assalamu alaikum. I hope you are well wherever you are. This is going to be a fairly lengthy program, I think, fairly lengthy video. And I have to make these lengthy videos because there are some of you that do require a little bit more insight. And so for those of you who don't like long videos, maybe you can just skip. But, it's amazing. Sometimes it just, I see the questions that arise. I look at other content from other videos, other YouTubers and scholars, and I just see a gap, and I just realize that here's a major gap in terms of knowledge and understanding. And inshallah, if Allah gives me the strength and the ability and the understanding, I'm the one that can fill that gap. And here we go. This video that I'm going to cover now, that I'm going to deal with, the topic that I'm going to deal with, is on the philosophy, the philosophical trends within Islam historically. So I'm going to look at the, we call it mazahib, right? So a mazhab can be interpreted somehow as a philosophical trend or a school of thinking. And most of you probably are under the impression that there are 4 mazahib, or maybe 5, But in reality, there are many streams and many schools of thinking that arose throughout the history of Islam. And so I'll be touching on some of them. I can't go into everyone in detail, but I can definitely give you maybe some kind of a fairly enriching discussion that will spur you perhaps to go and do a bit of further research, and also to understand when you see the ignoramuses come and speak about philosophy, or the shallow-minded people speak about philosophy, you'll be able to interpret their weaknesses, or to see the weaknesses in their interpretations. So where do I begin? How do I approach a discussion on philosophy and the intellectual and scholarly streams of thinking? Let's call it the madhahib, just to keep a consistent term. Let me first start by referring to the lesson we learn from the Israelites, the Bani Israel, and the people that call themselves in these days the Jews. If you look at the Jewish people today in the world, then I do believe that the Muslims are set on a trajectory that will take us exactly to the type of schools of thought that exist within that religion. And what I discern within that school, within Jewish thinking, are 3 streams. The first one is the ultra-orthodox, or the orthodox stream. And those are the people that are hell-bent on implementing the letter of the law, which they call the halakha, right? The Sharia of the Jews. And the halakha is a much more stringent and taxing system of laws than the Sharia of the Muslims. And so there are those, but they are absolutely a minority, very, very few. The practicing Jews that uphold the Mosaic law, or the halakha, are an absolute minority. So that's the one group. Minority, almost to a point of being insignificant. Especially if you look at the political power in the world today, as far as the Israelites or the Jewish people are concerned, is that really they don't hold much power. The power really is wielded by what we call the secular Jews. Now, what are the secular Jews? The secular Jews are those Jews who believe in the Mosaic law. They admit to the law, but they just don't implement it. They just use whatever reasoning to find it unnecessary for them to fully or to implement it at all. And so they would be non-practicing. And so those Jews would be Jews. They would follow certain rituals, customs, cultural norms, but they won't uphold, for example, dietary laws such as abstaining from eating pork. They would not observe Shabbos or the Sabbath, which is a very, very important and serious requirement. And so they would be what you call secular Jews. And then on the other extreme, you get the atheist Jews. And atheist Jews are Jews in nothing else except historical sort of affiliation. So they look at their history, at their legacy, at the Jewish legacy, and just see themselves as sharing in the legacy of the Jewish history, of the great Jewish history. And so they would not really believe at all in the existence of a God, and they are completely atheistic. And believe it or not, the first time I met an atheist Jew, I did meet many Jews in my life, Jewish people, and the one I met in quite a substantial amount of interaction, I learned that atheism is very possible for Jewish people, and they could be an atheist and be a Jew, and read the scriptures and read the Kabbalah and read the Talmud but not believe in God. So it's interesting that you get those divisions, right? So I'm sure there are more divisions, but I'm not doing a scholarly analysis. I'm just telling you those are the three divisions that I've discerned amongst the Jewish people. Now, I believe that the Muslims are on the same trajectory. I believe that the Muslims are on a trajectory where the rule of Islam is made so severe. The rules and the laws that these Salafists that trace their scholarship or their back to Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Hanbal, these people are the people of Hadith, right? They are the people of the Asar. They are the people who refuse to use their minds. They are the people who, instead of thinking, want to look for a Hadith. For every question that exists in this world, they want to go and find a Hadith. They refuse to put one and one together. So if they get a mathematical problem, I'm just taking this a bit to the extreme, but if they get a mathematical problem, they will go and look in the Hadith books for a weak Hadith or for any Hadith that can solve that mathematical problem, and then use that solution, even if it's the wrong answer. So they're the people who worship the ancient texts, what they call the Salaf. The Salaf are the three generations, the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, and the Tabi'i Tabi'in. So the original group of Sahabis, whom they believe could not make any mistakes in terms of interpreting the Qur'an, interpreting the words of the Prophet, interpreting any issue. They believe that none of these Sahabas, 120,000 of them, could make any mistake, could have any lapse in memory, could make any mistake in interpreting the law, the Quran, the words of the Prophet. So they have perfect memory and perfect analytical powers and perfect understanding. And that is the powers they afford to the Salaf. Right. Which I don't agree with, of course. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't admit to being reasonable. Because they're the same people that accuse the Shia of making 12 imams or 14 people ma'sumin, infallible. So they're the same people that say the Shia have 14 infallibles, but they have 120,000 Sahaba that are de facto infallible. So I believe the Salafists are the people who are heading for that particular category that we call Orthodox Jews. Right? Those who are obsessed with filling in the minutiae, the detail of the law, who are less concerned with the bigger picture, but are obsessed with the detail and refuse to think, but simply incorporate the text, whatever they can trace back of the recorded texts or recorded reports of the Salaf. So that's the Salaf, right? The Salafists, and they very, very powerful and influential group, because not because they are strong, but because the alternative is so weak. So let's look at another section or another school, and that is the mass of Muslims that follow the Ash'ari or the Maturidi schools of thought, Aqidah, as they say. Now that would be the mass of Muslims, and I'm not going to go into detail about Maturidi or Ash'ari Aqidah, but what I can tell you is that at heart it's a compromise. It's really a compromise between several schools of thought that existed around the year 200 to 300 after Hijrah. Because the Maturidi or the Ash'ari scholars were faced with a great many contradictory philosophies in Islam, right? So they were faced, and this is, you know, I'm not just giving you the Ash'ari school of thought, which the majority of Muslims nowadays adhere to, although they don't know it, but they do adhere to it. And I'm going to give you now some key points of what it means to be a Ash'ari. But what the Ash'ari faced around 200-300 years after the Hijrah, after the death of the Prophet also, were several schools of thought that were extremely powerful and extremely cogent, coherent in their arguments. Like, for example, you had the Khawarij. Now, the Khawarij had a position that was also a school of thought. They still, not too much. I think there's a certain version of the Khawarij in existence, the Ibadiyya. And the Khawarij's position was that if you don't observe the law, if you flout the law of Islam, if you are weak for whatever reason or undisciplined in implementing the law, if you make any mistake in terms of implementing the law of Sharia, you are outside the fold of Islam. So they condemn the committer of a sin to kufr, to blasphemy. So to commit a sin is an act of blasphemy according to the Khawarij. And the Khawarij is a school of thought, so they believe that you have to observe the law 100% or you become a kafir. Now on the other side, and I'm still telling you the streams of thinking which the Ash'ari, Al-Ash'ari, the scholar, which he faced, why the Ash'ari madhab came about. Because he, on the one hand, he faced the Khawarij. Then there was the Murji'iyah. That was another group who had a completely different understanding. And they believed that if you commit a sin, it is overlooked. Because, you know, and before I get to that, that any person who says La ilaha illallah and commits any sin or offense or omission or flouts the law, they are completely Muslim, 100% accepted, and we have no right to condemn or judge them, to place them outside the fold of Islam. Now the Khawarij is the one, they say that you commit a sin, you're outside the fold. Murji'iyah, commit a sin, you're outside the fold. Right, and so the those are the two extremes. Now, why did the Murji'iyah say what they said? You see, the reason why these schools of thought came about, and I'm still on the Ash'ari, right? I'm still on the Ash'ari, but I'm just dwelling or maybe going into the Murji'iyah and the Khawarij to make you understand the Ash'ari better. Why the Murji'iyah took that position of extreme, you know what, no matter what you do, you're always a Muslim, is because it went back to the idea of Qada and Qadr. Qada and Qadr. So the Murji'iyah believed that man's actions are all created by God. God is the creator of your actions, and you have no power over your own actions. Do you understand? So what that means is that the sinner doesn't sin, but only acts in accordance with God's will. And so the sinner, in a way, is absolved of his sin because God has acted for him. So what the Jabarites say is that, and this is another word for the Jabariya and the Murji'iyah, you know, similar, because that is what the Murji'iyah really, where they got that belief from, is that God creates your actions, and you can't be blamed for your actions, and that's why we need to tolerate the committer of sins, the murtakib al-kaba'ir, the committer of a major sin, murtakibul kaba'ir. So the Murji'iyah and the Jabariyah, those who believe that God decides for you, they are kind of like, they find some sort of harmony between their thinking. Whereas the Khawarij, they felt that man has complete choice, and when you make the choice to commit the sin, you have made the choice to leave the religion also, and they're intolerable of any personal choice. All right, let's go to the other stream of thinking. Right, so those two patterns of thinking confronted Ash'ari, the founder of the Ash'ari madhab, and he had to make sense of it, because both of these came with these arguments. Now, what is he supposed to say? God doesn't create your actions, or God creates your actions? If he says God doesn't create your actions, it means you are reducing, you are subtracting from God's power. And if you say that God does create your actions, then you are going the route of the Murji'iyah. Then you are absolving people of all their sins. And the great Umayyad kings like Yazid, who was a sinner, who was known to have not complied with the laws of the Sharia and of the Fiqh and Qur'an, that was his argument. You know, the Umayyads were generally Jabarites. They were generally people who believe that God decides for us. And so if he drank himself to a stupor, and if he lay there drunk, he would say, look, this is God's will for me, you know, I didn't decide this is God's decision for me. And so Ash'ari had this difficult dilemma to take a position that was like not in either of the two extremes. Of course, he was also confronted with another school besides the Khawarij, and besides the Murji'iyah, and besides the Jabariyah and the Qadariyah. The Qadariyah are, of course, those who believe that God has no say in your actions. You are a completely independent person with self-determination, independently of God's will. So the idea of Qada and Qadr plays a big role there. Also, what Ash'ari had to deal with was the existence of another school that was around also before his time, called the Mu'tazila. Now, what is the Mu'tazila? The Mu'tazila is another word for Mu'tazila is the rationalists, and they had a very coherent body of philosophy also. Like, according to the Mu'tazila, they took a beautiful position, and I mean, I'm confessing and I'm giving away my sympathies here, because that is really the one that makes sense. According to the Mu'tazila, how do they make sense of the two extremes? The Jabarites, those who believe that God makes every decision on your behalf, and the Qadarites, those who believe that you make all the decisions with no intervention from God's side. How does the Mu'tazila view that? What they say is that you are actually the master of your own destiny. You make your own decisions, and you are in control of your destiny. So the Mu'tazila are a deterministic school. They believe that man has self-determination. Very, very importantly. What they also believe is that God has knowledge of your choices, because God is timeless and trans-spatial. And so God is not confined by space or time. And therefore your decisions are like a painting to God. Your decisions are like a canvas, you know, and all your decisions are already there in front of God, which you have drawn. And that is the Mu'tazila's view of Qada and Qadr, is that man is the creator of his own destiny and his own decisions. God is knowledgeable of all those decisions, and around those decisions, God creates the universe and all other reality around those decisions. And the plan of God unfolds in spite of your decisions. So the plan, the master plan of the universe does not unfold as per your choices. That's the master plan. It unfolds in spite of your plans, of your decisions. Although your immediate life and your immediate experience is affected by your decisions, the greater plan, the master plan, unfolds in spite of your decisions. And that is how the Mu'tazila regards the idea of Qada and Qadr. Now the problem with the Ash'ari school is that they then had the challenge of making sense, because there were certain hadiths that seemed to contradict these positions. And there was some silly logic also that seemed to contradict these positions. Like, for example, the committer of a sin. Now, one of the teachings of the Mu'tazila is that God is of necessity just. God is of necessity just. And what the Mu'tazila says is they insist on the justice of God, and there is no exception to that rule at any point in the universe, or at any point in history. But what the Ash'ari dealt with was that they had to deal with a problem of injustices, and they had to ascribe these injustices, which were committed by some of the kings and some of the sultans who claimed to be the shadow of God on earth, who claimed to be the will of God on earth, Amirul Mu'mineen. Some of these corrupt scoundrels amongst the Umayyads and the Abbasids claimed to be the voice of God, the hand of God on earth. They had to, unfortunately, they were under pressure to excuse some of that behavior. Like, take an example, the Umayyad Caliph, the first one in the Umayyad dynasty, Muawiyah. How do you explain the war between Muawiyah and Ali if you are to argue that God is just? Will God create two perfectly just men? Like, if we argue that Muawiyah is a Sahabi, which means Sahabis are flawless, they don't make any rash or illegal decisions. And if we believe that Ali is a Sahabi also, who makes no sinful or irrational or wrongful decisions. How do we explain that these two righteous men, and I'm speaking now on behalf of the typical Ash'ari thinker, how do we explain two men of God making war, killing tens of thousands of people in the process, devastating the Muslim world, the Muslim treasury? And how do you explain then that God is just? Because you can't explain that God is just, yet God has two men of him, both believing in him, that are killing and massacring and hurting, wiping out masses of men. So in order to maintain the justice of Muawiyah and to defend Ali, the Ash'ari has to invent a compromise on the idea of the justice of God. And they eliminated that requirement because the Mu'tazila was around before Ash'ari. Ash'ari is a response to Mu'tazila, right? Mu'tazila says that God is just. But now people are making war. You want to excuse the behavior of Muawiyah. What's the way to do it is? You have to say that God is not always just. And that is what the Ash'ari then, the position they arrived at was that God is not always just. It's possible for God to be unjust also at times. Now that is absolute bunkum. We can never, ever, ever accept that position. Because if God is unjust, then the sinner will be rewarded and the righteous will be punished. And we have no hope. The promise of God cannot hold true. And yet, God says in the Qur'an, Wa'dullahi, the promise of God will hold true. So let us quickly look at some of the basic beliefs of the Ash'ari, and you can see how this was influenced by the trends that were present at the time when the Ash'ari madhab was formed or developed by its founders. So I've mentioned to you a few features of that Ash'ari madhab. The one is that God is not of necessity just. Number two, another important core belief that I will show you now, is that Qada and Qadr, man is partially responsible for his own actions. But now, you see, this is another weakness. You cannot say that you hold somebody partially accountable for the actions. If you have an employee, somebody who works for you, and you tell them, listen, I want you to carry all the sand from here to there, right? You're going to have to walk with a wheelbarrow and transfer the sand from this side to that side. But you have power over the wheelbarrow, and you make the wheelbarrow sort of dysfunctional or something, or you make the sand, very difficult to carry or very heavy. What you see, the moment you have an impact on the decision, it's no longer that workers or that employee's decision. And so when the Ash'ari madhab says that God is a partner in your decisions, then in fact it's as good as saying that you have no independent decision-making powers. And so let me quickly show you some of the beliefs of the Ash'ari, and then you are free to let me show you some of it. Basic beliefs of the Ash'ari. The mind cannot decide what is good and evil. The Sharia or divine law shall decide what is good and evil. Now that is a response to the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila says that the mind can decide what is good and what is evil. We are pre-programmed, we are predisposed to righteous behavior. The essentiality of there being a Sharia, and we are not accountable until we have not been given a Sharia, fair point. Iman is the assertion of correct belief, while concomitant practices are complementary. So what they say is that the belief that there is a God, that there is a book, that there is a hereafter, all of these beliefs are a requirement. However, the practice in terms of those are not necessarily incumbent, so they are complementary. And what that means is that practice really is not compulsory for you to be a mu'min. Another important point, the punishment for the committer of major sins is an affair that lies with Allah. He can pardon or He can punish. So that is the next point. And as you can see, this is a response to the Murji'iyah and to the Khawarij. The Khawarij says the Murtakibul Kaba'ir, the committer of a major sin, is a non-Muslim or is a kafir. And so Ash'ariyah tries to make sense and bring the two together, and so he says no, but there's a midway point. Affirmation of all the attributes describing the qualities of Allah. Right. So it's nothing is wajib or compulsory on Allah. It is permissible for Allah to speak in untruth or to break a promise. If Allah so wishes, He could punish the righteous with hell and reward the unrepentant sinner with paradise. And this is a book. The text I'm showing you here is, for those of you who are interested, is a text that is used at the Al-Azhar. It's a book that comes out in Arabic, Mudhakiratul Firaq, and it is a book that is in Arabic, and I've made the effort of translating it for you into English. You can go and find the Arabic. Mutawalli is the author. Allah is the creator of a person's action. The individual does have a certain share in it. Can you see? There's the point that I mentioned to you. Allah is actually the creator of a person's actions. Good and evil occur by the will of Allah. Allah's will is to be separated from what He commands and is satisfied with, and there is no connection between them. The possibility of seeing Allah, that's another crazy story, the belief, right? The intercession, that's another false belief, granted to the Prophet with the permission of Allah. The committer of major sins may receive intercession while they believe in these more false beliefs, questioning the qabr, punishment or peace, the coming back to life and the right path, the scale. I hope you can see then what I'm saying about the Mu'tazila is that it came as a response to the dilemma that these scholars had when they saw the Murji'iyah, the Khawarij, the Qadariyah, the Jabariyah, the Mu'tazila, and they tried to create a philosophical understanding that could create a broad church, as they say, a big tent. So that is really what the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is, because the definition of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is those who adhere to the Aqidah as espoused by Mansur Maturidi and Hassan Ash'ari. Right, so these two scholars, they are the two guys that lay the basis for Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah Aqidah or core beliefs. I'm not so familiar with the Maturidi beliefs, but I do believe that it's very minuscule. And but I've given you some of the ideas or beliefs that I regard as important as far as the Ash'ari is concerned. Now that as I said, gives you an idea of what the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah beliefs are. So where does the Salafists fit in? Where do the Salafists fit in here? You see, the problem with the Ash'ari is that they did not, the Salafists or the Atharis or the Hanbalites were a fanatical hadith madhab, also of early times. In fact, the Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who lived about 250 after the Prophet, the Hijrah, before Ash'arism became a madhab, he had a fanatical attachment to hadith. And he would never accept things like, for example, the mind, let's see, like, you know, because in Ash'arism, there's sometimes the belief that you can use sort of logical deduction, although they don't go all the way. There's room made in Ash'arism or Ahli Sunnah for some sort of rational thinking and deduction. And you know, if you go to Al-Azhar school in Egypt, which is regarded as the most important religious authority or the most important institution of Muslim learning in the Sunni world, then you will see that they are not averse to logical and rational reasoning when it comes to particular laws. And for that reason, they have looked at the moon sighting and become very liberal and accepting of ideas such as using calculations, which would nowhere have been present in the time of the Prophet. So the Ash'aris, they make room for some sort of logical reasoning, although they don't put a lot of emphasis on it. Hanbalism or Asarism or Salafism have placed no value in logical reasoning, in rational thinking. And they seek a hadith or a text for everything. If a Sahabi said it, if a Khulafa, one of the members of the Khulafa Rashideen said it, if Ibn Taymiyyah said it, if Hassan al-Basri said it, Tabi'in, if all these, Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Umar, anyone, if they said it, it is as good as the truth, and they will refrain and reject any reasoning in favor of finding a proof. Now, why is Salafism more powerful? Why is Salafism more powerful? Because that's really the question I want to answer. And I know we're running a bit long here, but I need to make this point quickly and then we'll see where we go from there. Why is Salafism more powerful? You see, Salafism is a more consistent and coherent outlook. Salafism, the idea that all answers must be sought in the text, is a more crisp and exact or clear instruction or guideline to Muslims, to scholars. Because think of it like this: if you tell people that you may use logical deduction or you may use a hadith, you are not offering people hardline, clear instructions, because then you might get those who want to do logical deduction get out of control, and that is exactly what's happening in the Muslim world today. Ash'ari or Ahli Sunnah wal Jamaat is there's a lot of centrifugal or there's forces that are tearing it apart, and those forces are those who are using more and more rational thinking and logical deduction, will become part of what we call the modernist trend or the postmodernist trend, who are thinking and analyzing Islam to pieces, right? So they are applying so much analysis and rational deduction and logical thinking, and I wouldn't call it logical thinking because there's a difference between kalam and philosophy. And I rather use the word, what is the word that I want to use? Sophistry. Sophistry or scholasticism. Now, there's a difference between philosophy and sophistry. You see, sophistry is an evil art of playing with words. Philosophy is the healthy practice of thinking rationally and using certain rules of thinking and reasoning. Sophistry is playing with words. It's demagoguery. It's impressing people with flowery speeches and with appealing to people's emotions, and it doesn't have any relation with philosophy. And so what we find is sophistry in the Muslim world is very present within the modernist trend, within the postmodernist trend, and often I've seen some very prominent people, fall in a trap of becoming modernists. In other words, over applying kalam or the narrative or deconstruction, as they use the term in postmodernism, to the texts. And if you start deconstructing the text, whether it's the Qur'an or the Hadith, which I don't regard as sacred, then you don't know where you're going to end up. You see, then you are on your own on the ocean on a rudderless boat. And so that is exactly what is happening, is that the Ash'ari, because it doesn't have clear guidelines, it says God makes your decision. Well, God doesn't really make the decision. God is just. Well, God isn't really just. Well, you can use reasoning. Well, you can't exactly always use reasoning. You can also use hadith. Because of its indecisive positions, this Ash'ari school, it is weaker than a Salafist school, which is very exact, very stern, very firm on its principle that we only look at the text and nothing else. And even if the text says that God has eyes and he has a pair of legs and a shin, we accept it. We never question the text. If the text says that God comes to the second heaven every night and come and visits the angels, yes, we believe it. So the thing is, no matter how horrible and how offensive some of the beliefs are, it fits in with the idea that the text is always right. Of course, ISIS, the barbarians of Iraq and of the Levant, are Salafists. It's in their blood. It's what drives them. And why they commit the atrocities, why they throw people from buildings, why they rape women captives, is because they see it in the texts. And they don't give a damn about what is logical, what is repulsive, what is barbaric. For them, it's the texts. And why I'm so critical about people like Muhammad Hijab and Ali Dawa and Hakikachu is they are slaves to the text. Now, not only the Quranic text, I'm a servant of the Quranic text. Not always in a literal sense. Remember, the Quran does have the mutashabihat and the muhkamat. Not every verse is literal. But they regard every verse in the Quran as literal, and every hadith has to be read as literal. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hadith must be literal, and there's no rational, no logic with them. So they are a healthy, strong, coherent belief system, but also barbaric, unfortunately. And although they are very influential, very easy to find followers, because Muslims generally love certainty. Let me just quickly branch out now. So I've given you why the Ash'ari how the Ash'ari came about, how the Salafist came about. The Salafist, to a large extent, the revival of Salafism came at times when there was a lot of upheaval in the Muslims. So the first major revival of Salafism was around the time when, just after the fall of Baghdad, I believe, in around about, is it 1200s? I think there's the person of Ibn Taymiyyah. In a world gone crazy, when the Sufis were in full bloom, when the Jabarites, when the Shia, there were so many different schools of thought around, and there was such a great deal of chaos when when the Mongols were invading and destroying, and there was threats from every direction. It was a very, very chaotic time in the Muslim world, on the streets, and people were confused, and it affected their lives, and they needed the hardcore, a hardline way of thinking through things. And that is the context where Ibn Taymiyyah writes, and that is where he comes with his hardline views, is that forget about thinking, forget about free thinking, just quote the text. And Ibn Qayyim, I think, was a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, and he built further on that. And the Wahhabis who came in this 18th century, another revival of the Salafist madhab, the same thing, upheaval, you know, with colonialism, Muslim world being colonized, with Europeans marching into Muslim capitals, taking control of Jerusalem, of Egypt, walking into Egypt in 1799, invading Egypt, Napoleon. A similarly confusing and chaotic time for Muslims, and there we have the emergence, a re-emergence of Salafism under the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. And so every time the Muslim world is in conflict, in chaos, is intellectually confused, they resort back to the Salafists, who is a group that gives you certainty, that is black and white, no confusion, direct instructions. And that is why today in the West also we find that some of these Salafis are very popular. In fact, even in the Muslim world, why ISIS was able to recruit people. Now, I know Taliban are more Ash'ari than Salafist, but they overlap in a very big way. And so, again, the Salafists are gaining support because they come with a clear message. But Islam was never a fascist system, you see, and no matter how comfortable it makes you feel that you have a strong, powerful, scholarly class in control, it does not match the ethos of the Quran. Because the ethos of the Quran is that Islam is not to be imposed. Thinking and behavior is not to be imposed. And there are many verses of the Quran that you can find that we always cite. And Salafism is basically a form of fascism. It's a form of imposing, using violence to coerce and to force people to act in accordance with the Sharia that they see as the Sharia. So you know, in my previous videos I spoke to you about the madrasa and how kids are beaten up. I was like assaulted at madrasa. It's because the same Wahhabi order that is based on coercion, compulsion, fascism is the one that we have grown up with in the past 50 to 100 years. And that is the dominant order in Islam. The Turkish Empire, when the Turks ruled, it was very different. It was a much more forgiving, tolerant rule, the Turkish rule. And if you had lived in the year 1750 under under the height of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, maybe the 1600s, 1700s, you would be experiencing a very tolerant society where there would be very little Islam or rules imposed on you. Because the Ottomans were essentially more slanted towards the Sufi type of Islam, you know, spiritual expression of Islam, whereas the Salafist is an extremely dogmatic, literal expression of Islam. So that is to give you an idea of the different schools, Salafist, Ash'ari, how that links to the others, and then the Mu'tazila. Now let me, I wouldn't be doing justice to the topic if I didn't complete the circle and bring in the Shia and maybe even the Sufi orders, because those are other streams or trends within Islam. The Sufi orders and the Shia madhab. Now there's a lot of affinity between them, by the way, interestingly so, because I mean the Shia, the Sufi orders, 11, I think all but one of the main Sufi tariqas trace their spiritual mastership or guidance back to Imam Ali alayhi salam. Right? So so most of the Sufi orders actually do accept the Imams as at least at the level of spiritual guides. And these are the same Imams that are the Shia political and spiritual guides in the Shia madhab. So the Shia, of course, is a phenomenon within the Muslim body over the centuries that has at times been extremely powerful, like for example with the Fatimid Empire ruling over Egypt and parts of North Africa. I think we're looking at the the Common Era, we're looking at, I think, the 1300s, 1200s. Those are the years in which the Fatimids rule. And of course, being very influential, the Fatimids, you see, the Sunni and the Shia is not a neat, we can't separate them neatly. You can't say that the Shia is in Iran. No, historically the Shia is not in Iran. The Shia was everywhere. The Shia was in North Africa. The Shia was in Egypt. In fact, the University of Al-Azhar in Cairo today is a creation of the Shia, or the Fatimid Empire. The word Al-Azhar is a masculine form of the word Zahra, which is the name of the daughter of the Prophet, Fatima to Zahra. So the Al-Azhar is named after the daughter of the Prophet. So it's named after a prominent character within Shia, the Shia ideology. So the two that I haven't mentioned were the Shia and the Sufi. Now, let me quickly dispense with the Sufi orders. The Sufi orders is a response to the more mystical expression of Islam in the Quran and in other texts, but mainly in the Quran. Because the Quran is an extremely mystical book. There are certain aspects of the Quran that refer to God as the light, to God as the eternal, to man as the soul, man as gifted the soul from God. So there are these references to mystical elements like the soul, God, merging with God, the nafsul mutma'inna, nafsul lawama, you know, the various types of souls that are characterized in the Quran. And the Sufi Islam is a reading of the Quran that focuses on the spiritual aspects. In other words, it looks at everything else, not necessarily denying it, but just regarding those other elements, let's say jihad, salah, and all the other zakah, welfare, marriage, all the other elements of the code. It sees those elements as mere means towards an end. And the Sufi sees the end as being, Ya ayyuhatun nafsul mutma'inna, is the emergence of the soul in absolute and ultimate equilibrium. So the soul that reaches a point of fana, and by fana we mean ego death, and that is really the intention of the Sufi. The mystical expression of Islam is to achieve a position of self-annihilation, of ego annihilation, fana. And what is self-annihilation? It means where your will is merged, you adopt the will of God for yourself. So you surrender all voluntary actions. So there's a difference here. You see, when you argue from the Murji'iyah position, then God is making your decisions. The Sufi says that it is not God that makes decisions for you, it is you that is adopting God as the decision maker. And that is the position of fana. That is the nafsul mutma'inna. And it sees, especially chapter 30, part 30 of the Quran, and the last many chapters in the Quran as extremely central to that spiritual expression. And those mystical expressions necessarily have to be accompanied by a guide, because when we look at the allegorical verses, or the verses that are more figurative in nature, then it obviously requires the mind of a scholar, of a person who is immersed in that type of understanding. And so the novice or the dervish, the seeker, the treader of the path, requires the master to make clear those ideas that are mystical and unsure. That is the Sufi idea. And of course, very, very importantly, the Sufi regards the martyr, such as Imam Hussein, as of a particular high station, because the Quran does refer to those who have been killed in the way of Allah. Say not of them that they are dead. Bal ahya'un. They are alive. And so the Sufi sees the possibility of forms of life that are spiritual in nature. And Hussein being a spiritual force, in fact, not being alive. And so I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm telling you this, the Sufi take on the reading of the Quran is a bit different from these other more philosophical readings of the Quran. What it does find is it finds some alignment with the Shia, because the Shia is to a large extent also fairly heavily committed to a spiritual expression. Right? And although in Shia beliefs, or in the Shia school, it's referred to as the science or the field of irfan, knowledge. What is the word now? Gnosis, Gnosis, gnosis. So it's knowledge, super knowledge. It's knowledge that transcends regular knowledge that is pursued regularly. So I think I've given you an idea of the Sufi, but let me just speak to you about the Shia then. Where does the Shia fit in? Now the Shia is a discussion all on its own. Suffice it for me to tell you that the Shia is not always separated from the main body of Islam. Like the Fatimiyya, the Shia ruled. They ruled the most important centers of Islam, even during the Abbasid rule. Even during the Abbasid rule. There was a period during Abbasid rule when the prime ministers were all Shia. In fact, the Barmakis, if you look at the history of the Barmakis, these were a family of advisors to the Sultan or to the Caliph. They were Shia. And so even during Abbasid times, they had Shia advisors. It wasn't always a very neat and clear differentiation between Shia and Sunni. Imam Shafi'i was regarded as a Rafida, as a member of the Shia. And why? Because he was in contact with some Yemeni Shias, and he liked what he heard there, but he was scared out of his mind when the king or the caliph questioned him, interrogated him, and he changed his tune after that. So the Shia is not a separate entity, been always very, very much part of the main. There's always been an influential role of the Shia. Of course, the Shia is a political split. We know the political aspect of the split, and that is the difference between selection and election of the leader of the Muslims. Right. So within Shia beliefs, Imam Ali is supposed to be the first caliph after the Prophet, the first caliph, not Abu Bakr. But that understanding is not just a political decision. You see, it is political in one sense, because what the Shia say is that Ali never had a chance to be part of the decision. That decision was made at Bani Saqifa, at a certain family's house, and there they actually made the decision without Ali. So that is the political dispute, and that's only one aspect of the difference. It obviously goes deeper because the Shia are also a Mu'tazila branch, and maybe this comes to you as news, but the Shia, because it precedes the Ahli Sunnah wal Jamaat, or the Ash'ari school, because the Shias go back long before Ash'arism. Ahli Sunnah only comes 200-300 years. Shia goes back long before that, right? To the time of the Prophet's death. So the Shia was always associated more or less with the Mu'tazila, with the rationalists. Now, because the Shia has a rationalist philosophy, they believe that God is just. They believe that God cannot be unjust. The whole idea of Imam Ali being appointed by the Prophet is to serve or to give vent to the idea that God will not leave the people without a leader. God will not leave the people confused. And because God would not leave the people confused, I mean, Abu Bakr never left the people confused. Abu Bakr appointed Umar. Umar never left the people confused. Umar appointed the six, the electoral college of six. Sa'ad ibn al-Waqqas and Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and he appointed, he never left the people in limbo. Uthman never, well, Uthman was killed. So none of the first two Khulafa left the people in limbo. So the Shia is saying, why would the Prophet leave the masses in limbo and not make known who he wants as a successor? And so the Shia not only relates the idea of Ali being the first king or the first Imam as a political decision, but also as a philosophical position, as a position that is born out of the core philosophy of justice of God. And so the Shia, everything in the Shia is based on the justice of God, the self-determination of people, and those core Mu'tazila doctrines are all in the traditional Shia. But I'm going to end off here, and then we'll be on an hour, just nicely on an hour. You mustn't read or see the Shia of today as necessarily the Shia of early Islam. You see, the Shia of today has undergone turmoil and modifications and changes and influences, just as the Ahli Sunnah has undergone. The greatest impact on Shia beliefs happened around the 1500s, Common Era, when the Safavid king, when the Safavid Shah turned Iran into a Shia country and recruited scholars that would create a Shia state religion. And that state religion, which the Shah wanted to create in the 1500s, is an animal that is very different. That Shia state religion is something very different to the early Shiism, you see. And that is why I challenge, why I always have a problem with Safavid Shiism, because it is a Shiism that is a new form of orthodoxy. It is a new form of imposition by scholars. It is a new form of Orthodox Islam that is competing now with Sunni Orthodox Islam. And really, if you want to look for Shiism that is most loyal or most faithful to the early ideas of Shiism, it's probably the Zaydiyah. It's probably the Yemenis, probably the Houthis, but you know, you can debate that point with me. You can tell me what you think of it. But I think I've given you a decent or a neat introduction or just an overview of how the madhabs in Islam work and where they come from and how they are related and how they are connected. And I hope you will be able to read more and to have the necessary context when you do read for yourself. So thank you. It was a lengthy video. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and I'm very happy and I'm very honored to have shared my understanding with you. Make of it what you like. Hopefully it will help you to build your understanding. I thank Allah for giving me the opportunity. All praise and thanks are due to Allah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.